Despite being a movie that I personally loved when I first saw it, the 2010 live-action Alice in Wonderland film has both critics and audiences wanting more. And maybe it's because I was about 6 when I first saw it and therefore have some nostalgia-based biases. I do think it deserves more credit than it's getting afforded, both as a kids movie and as an adaptation of the Alice in Wonderland books. Hi fellas, my name is Teddy Clyde, and I have too many opinions on things that do not matter. Before we get into it, here are some general channel updates. First up, I've moved. Woo. Welcome to the new place. Hopefully soon I will have some more permanent decorations, but for now, please enjoy the Alice in Wonderland poster cutout that my friend made. Secondly, I'm going to increase the number of videos I've been making to about 2 a month, so having one that is more researched and scripted like this one, and a second one that is a little more loose, like ad-lib rambling about things and or like tier lists. So look out for those. Get excited. Yay. For years I had assumed that people had the same fondness for this movie as I did, or at least enjoyed it enough as a kid's movie. But it wasn't until I saw people more recently putting it towards the bottom of their ranking of live-action remakes that I realized that assumption was deeply wrong. And before you get into the comments to complain, here are some things that this video is not saying. First up, I am not arguing that Tim Burton is a good person or a perfect director. His whole, I'm not going to put black people in my movies because they clash with my aesthetic, is insane and, like, super problematic. Second, I'm not arguing that this movie is the best film I have ever seen and deserved to win every Oscar and every award, just that it's being judged a little harshly for what it actually is, and maybe deserves a little more credit. And thirdly, I'm not arguing that this is a perfect one-to-one with the books, but I do have more on that later. For a general recap of what happens in this movie, we are introduced to a 19-year-old Alice who's returning to Wonderland, which is technically called Underland in this movie, but I'm choosing to ignore that for now. Anyway, she just ran off because a ginger man proposed to her and she didn't want to say yes, which, like, who can blame her, and has fallen down the rabbit hole. The Wonderland that we are introduced to is in the middle of some political unrest between the reigning queen, who is the Red Queen, and the White Queen, who has been dethroned. The White Queen's people have been working in secret to bring Alice back to Wonderland to help defeat the Red Queen and her not dragon, the Jabberwock, because it's been prophesized, but no one is quite certain whether or not this Alice is the correct Alice, especially not Alice herself, because she does not remember any of her original time in Wonderland. Despite her not believing that she is the correct Alice, and also thinking that the entire thing is just a dream, she does do her part to help the White Queen's people, who coincidentally just keep getting captured by the Red Queen. When she goes to help save the Hatter, who's been captured and is going to, get decapitated, off with their heads and stuff, she ends up grabbing the Vorpal sword, which is the only thing that can defeat the Jabberwock. The gang all end up at the White Queen's palace after a mini revolt breaks out at the Mad Hatter's execution, which, doesn't really stick due to some Cheshire Cat shenanigans. At the palace, the caterpillar starts talking to Alice and explaining how he's pretty certain at this point that she is almost the correct prophesized Alice, the one who needs to, kill that definitely not a dragon. In this conversation, she suddenly starts to remember her time in Wonderland as a kid, and now it's up to her to decide whether she is going to take on that prophecy or not. Alice, of course, decides it's prophecy time, kills that bitch, and makes the difficult decision to go back home. At which she fully turns down that poor ginger man, and then decides to take up her deceased father's position in his company, and is now on a boat to travel the world. The end, I guess. Which is a pretty simple plot. And the people online are more than happy to let you know how nothing and simple this plot is. And I don't think those people understand that a plot being simple does not immediately make it bad. again, this may just be the nostalgia talking, but in my rewatch of this movie for the video, I thought they handled the overall messages of overcoming imposter syndrome and how large acts of bravery often require small individual pieces of bravery to get to that point pretty well. Were they done in a way that I'd want in a movie aimed at older audiences? Of course not. But they do make sense for a movie that is aimed at pre-high school aged kids. I didn't end up rewatching the sequel movie Through the Looking Glass, mostly because it doesn't have a real impact on my opinion of the first movie, but also because it sucks. But from what I remember, it does have a much more complicated plot than this first movie does. And is this because they used the two existing Alice in Wonderland books to build the first movie and then didn't really have any basis to make a second one off of? Yeah, probably. But also, having a more complex plot didn't make it make any more sense. With that, I ran into people complaining that the plot made too much sense. Oh no, the horror. If you were to make a 1-to-1 adaptation of the Lewis Carroll books, they would not be very good. Nothing makes sense, scenes run into one another, and everything feels like a dream, because, quite literally, it is all a dream in both Through the Looking Glass and in Alice in Wonderland. In the book Through the Looking Glass, there is a scene where Alice is in a shop. The shop turns into a lake, then back into a shop again. She tries to buy an egg, and when she goes to grab the egg gets like further and further away as she tries to get it, and then eventually that egg turns into Humpty Dumpty on a wall outside, and now we're no longer in the shop somehow. And this has literally no bearing on the vague plot of this book of Alice becoming a queen in a chess game. This just happens. Yes, the 2010 version could have more whimsy and nonsense in it, but every single adaptation of Alice in Wonderland that I've seen changes the plot in some way to make it make more sense. And that, I think, is totally okay. There's a vibe in a lot of the critiques I've run into that they really appreciate and like the 1951 version of Alice in Wonderland that Disney made, and are a little upset that this version doesn't emulate that one more. And I can't blame them for it, because that is a great movie, but I think people don't realize how much that movie isn't a direct 1-to-1 translation of the Alice in Wonderland book as they'd like to think it is. It takes pieces of Through the Looking Glass, including the talking flowers, Tweedledee and Tweedledum, the walrus and the carpenter, and the entire concept of an unbirthday, and adds it all in, and then completely strips away the character of the Duchess, who is a major character in the original book, who is also the one who the White Rabbit is actually working for and shows up multiple times. And we are all okay with that, because it makes the plot better. I say these things not to bad dog the 50s version, but to prove the point that sometimes making changes to the story helps it and makes it better. And also, sometimes stories have been told so many times that if you do it the exact same way, it's going to feel flat. So, you may not like the changes that the 2010 version of Alice in Wonderland made, but I at least admire them for making something new that still feels rooted in the original story without feeling like a direct copy of every other version of Alice in Wonderland out there, and there are enough of those already that we do not need another. I consider this Alice in Wonderland to be closer to Maleficent as a remake, where they change aspects of the story to give flat characters some more nuance and give a new insight into the story that's happening, as opposed to something like Cruella, where they deviated so far from the original plot of the story that these are no longer the same people. And that's why I personally think Maleficent works as a remake and Cruella really doesn't. But if you ever want to hear more opinions on that, let me know, because I've got a lot. Now, a lot of people complain that this movie is just Tim Burton's slop, which it kinda is. He did make the movie. But also, if you know you don't like Tim Burton, why are you watching one of his movies? I did have some friends tell me that this movie has the exact same vibes as Sweeney Todd, which does seem a little strange, seeing as one is a kid's movie about Alice in Wonderland and one is like a musical about cannibalism, I think. And I really can't argue for or against it because I haven't seen it, but that does seem strange. But I think some people just get so hung up on and upset about a director having a very specific style, which is an insane standard to have. I personally don't care for Wes Anderson films. They all have the same vibe to me, and I personally just don't like it. But I am not outwardly seeking to watch his movies and then complaining that it feels like he made them, because I know I just don't personally enjoy that style. I do, however, enjoy Del Toro films, which I like because they feel like he made it, and I like his style. But somehow, for this movie in particular, it is a valid criticism to say it feels like Tim Burton made it, and that's somehow a problem, I guess? Which, this just feels like people complaining about there being cows on a cow farm. Like, guys, be so real, it's not that serious. Some things are just not made for you. To continue my side rant about this, can you imagine if we held all other artists to this exact same standard? Like, man, I love Van Gogh, but his new piece feels too swirly, and, like, he painted it too much, and that's a problem to me. Or, man, I love They Might Be Giants, but they put accordion in their new song, and I don't understand why they would do that, because they've used too much accordion in their other songs, so they really shouldn't put it in again. Like, that would be crazy. But somehow with directors, it is totally fine to argue that they made the movie and it feels too much like they made it. And it's just, why do we do this? And I do feel like most of the time when people do this, they are criticizing only directors they don't like, and instead of saying, hey, personally, this director style isn't for me, they are arguing this style is bad, and anytime they make a new movie in that style, how dare they? It feels like the same thing. And I'm like, just get over yourself and understand that not every movie is going to be something you personally enjoy, and that is normal. Guys. Now, complaining about specific aspects is all good. Like, I agree with so many that Johnny Depp as the Mad Hatter was a choice, and that maybe Tim Burton didn't need to cast his little guy in this one, maybe. I didn't like the vibe he brought to the role. I don't think it fit the character very well, but I don't think it ruined my enjoyment of the overall movie. With what we know now about Johnny Depp, in hindsight watching it now, it doesn't make it any better, but at the time this movie came out, it was still a weird choice. And don't get me started on the weird, cringy things that this movie does, but I do think that the Tim Burton style, minus, the whole, racism thing, fits the Alice in Wonderland vibe and aesthetic really well. The movie itself is visually stunning, and yes, it is darker than the 1950s version, but I do think it fits more with the original illustrations of the book in how it's harsh and angular and just kind of off-putting, and especially with, the Queen of Hearts and her giant head, that fits how a lot of the characters were drawn originally. I love pretty much everything about the set design, the character design, and the costume design. Somehow, they made a 46-year-old Crispin Glover, the guy who plays George McFly, they somehow made him one of the most attractive men I think I've ever seen, which is insane. And don't get me started on Alice in that armor, or just, Anne Hathaway, or, everybody. Oh my god, they're all beautiful. I have never been more bisexual in my life than watching this movie. And on top of that, the CGI looks better than some of the big-budget Marvel movies that have come out over a decade later. Most of the characters in Wonderland have some amount of CGI affecting how they look, whether they are a fully CGI little mouse, or some combination of human and CGI, which we see in Tweedledee and Tweedledum and the Queen of Hearts. And they look fantastic. How they look so real but so inhuman at the same time, and how they walk that line between so many of these characters, but I do, looking at them, believe they exist. It's phenomenal. And I really have only one complaint where I don't love how the dog looks, but it's not bad. It's just a little uncanny to me personally, but overall, every single character looks so good and so real for being definitely not how they actually look. And apparently people agree with me on a lot of these points because it was up for Best Art Direction, Best Costume Design, and Best Visual Effects at the Oscars, winning the first two of those. So obviously it did do some things pretty well. Another Tim Burton staple is the Danny Elfman soundtrack, which suits this movie so well. That opening song haunts me a little bit, and only partially because I had to play it in orchestra when I was in middle school. Either way, it just fits the film and the vibes entirely, and there's a reason why Danny Elfman and Tim Burton keep working together. It is worth mentioning that Danny Elfman has some allegations against him, which does feel necessary to bring up. And it is a little strange how many people, it seems, have some concerning behavior that worked on this movie, but I don't think most people are using that in their criticisms of the film, so it doesn't really impact why people don't like these movies, but it is a little strange. But all of that aside, I think the thing that bothers me the most about the criticisms of this movie is that most of them ignore the fact that it was never supposed to be a direct one-to-one recreation of the original story, and there is an in-text explanation for this. The reason Alice refers to it as Wonderland and not Underland, the actual name for the location that she is in, is because when she first went there, she was 7. A 7-year-old is going to misunderstand the strange things around them and be confused about what's going on, and would reasonably remember it in a way that feels more fantastical than it actually was. And they would also very reasonably rename it to something that feels more fitting to what they remember, because she was 7. This movie walks the line of being a sequel to the 50s version, and I think it is a very reasonable read to think of it as such. So if you choose to think of the 50s one as what she experienced when she first went to Wonderland and saw it through those 7-year-old eyes, it being more whimsical and youthful and joyful in a way that a 7-year-old would see it, and it being different when she is an adult makes sense, and there is some evidence to this being the case, as the flashback we see of her being that kid has her painting those roses red, which doesn't happen in the book, but does happen in the original 50s movie. But it doesn't happen in this new one, because it is a different story this time. That is the point. But people are just so willing to be upset that it is not what the book was, and it's not what the 50s movie was, when that was never the point of this movie. And it explicitly says that. Guys, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but I get the feeling that this movie was somewhat rated so poorly because pretentious men didn't like that they made Alice an adult woman who gets the role of functionally dragon slayer as opposed to being an innocent, naive 7-year-old child who doesn't do anything. Which is a weird vibe that I really don't like the implications of. All in all, I don't think that Alice in Wonderland 2010 was the best it ever could have been, but the 55% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes feels pretty low for what it actually was. Sometimes it's good to step back when critiquing a film and think about what the filmmakers were actually aiming to do. And if they accomplish that goal, that is sometimes more important than being the perfect, deepest, most interesting, well-done movie. I talked to my friends who saw this movie as kids, and we all agreed that we loved it. We had a great time, and we all remember it incredibly fondly. Which to me says a whole lot more about its quality than a grumpy man who doesn't like Tim Burton or kids' movies complaining on the internet. But what do I know, I'm also grumpy and complaining on the internet. Anywho, thank you for sticking it out to the end here. As it is my unbirthday, you should consider subscribing and checking out my other videos. I have some other Disney-centered ones, but also other things, so feel free to check those out. Also, let me know if my friends are right about Sweeney Todd, and whether or not I should maybe watch that movie at some point. And elsewise, I hope you had a good time, and I'll see you next month.